The night was silent, until it wasn't. A single scream, torn from the throat of a dying man, split through the Virginia countryside in March of 1857. It wasn't the kind of cry you'd expect from war, or the whip, or even the cries of women giving birth in shacks hidden behind the great plantation houses. No, this scream was sharper, colder, final. The sound of life being severed in a way that no one in Cumberland County had ever imagined. By dawn, 11 white masters lay butchered in their own homes, carved with such precision that even the physicians called to the scene refused to describe the details aloud. Every body had been opened with surgical elegance, limbs separated at perfect joints, arteries severed in a way that ensured silence followed swiftly after shock. And yet, nothing in the houses had been stolen. Not a coin, not a scrap of food, not even a horse was taken. The man accused of this massacre, though in truth he was never properly tried, was a slave known only by one name, Isaac. Isaac the Butcher. 6.5 feet tall, shoulders like a wall, pale grey eyes that burned through men who dared to meet them. Isaac had once been valued for his strange skill with knives, his mastery of anatomy, his ability to dress livestock faster and cleaner than any man in Virginia. What his masters never understood was this. When you teach a man the secrets of flesh, when you show him how easily muscle separates from bone, you are not just creating a butcher of animals. You are forging something far more dangerous. This story was buried, scrubbed from textbooks, locked away in courthouse vaults, because it wasn't just about a slave killing his masters. It was about power reversing course, about the entire system of slavery realizing in one bloody night that the chains they placed on men could at any moment snap back and strangle them. The South never wanted you to hear this story. The North buried it under narratives of noble war and emancipation. But tonight, you're going to hear what really happened. And once you do, you will never look at America's history or the institutions that shape your world the same way again. Cumberland County in 1857 looked peaceful to the casual eye. Rolling tobacco fields stretched across the hills. The James River glistened as it carried barges of wealth downstream, and white families dined on porches while enslaved men and women bent beneath the sun until their backs nearly snapped. To the outside world, it was a picture of Southern order, wealth, hierarchy, civility. But order is always an illusion. Behind every polished dinner table, behind every hymn sung in the white clapboard churches, there pulsed an unspoken fear. The planters did not speak it aloud, but it was there. The knowledge that the entire system of slavery rested on a lie, that men could be property, that their rage could be silenced forever. Cornelius Petton, Isaac's master, believed himself immune to that fear. He had inherited not only land, but a reputation for control. He did not simply buy slaves, he acquired those other men couldn't tame. The broken ones, the violent ones, the ones who stared back at overseers instead of lowering their eyes. He believed his will was strong enough to break them. That arrogance would become his curse. When Isaac arrived at Petton Grove, he was put to work in the slaughterhouse. It was a brick building, heavy-walled and cold, built to keep meat fresh. It became his sanctuary and a place of knives and silence. There, Isaac perfected his art. He could separate tendon from bone with a flick of the wrist. He wasted nothing. He spilled no unnecessary blood. Witnesses whispered that he could cut a hog so cleanly, the animal didn't even scream. But something darker simmered beneath that silence. The white owners saw only efficiency, usefulness. What they failed to see was that Isaac was learning. Every cut on an animal was a rehearsal. Every bone dismembered was practice. And every day he sharpened his knives, he was also sharpening his mind. Men like Petton believed power was eternal, because it wore the mask of civilization. But power built on chains always rots from within. And on that night in 1857, when the lamps burned low and the fields fell silent, Isaac moved through the houses with a calm precision no overseer could match. He wasn't just killing, he was delivering a message, a reminder that fear belongs not to the enslaved, but to those who believe they own another man's flesh. And once the message was carved into 11 lifeless bodies, The entire South trembled with a truth it could never admit. Control is always temporary. The official story of that night was erased almost as quickly as it happened. Plantation families whispered of an unfortunate disturbance, while county officials spoke of tragic accidents. But buried inside courthouse vaults were reports too detailed, too damning to ever reach daylight. The sheriff's original notes described the scene not as a frenzy, not as rage, but as something orchestrated. 11 bodies arranged in deliberate fashion, limbs aligned in symmetrical patterns, eyes closed, as if Isaac himself had performed a ritual of final silence. Those who first stepped into the rooms described feeling as though they had entered a place not of murder, but of judgment. It wasn't chaos, it was order, and that terrified them more than anything, because a man in chains is not supposed to have order. He is supposed to break, to cry, to lose himself in madness. Isaac had not lost himself. He had mastered himself. Historians never wanted you to know this, because if you pull on the thread long enough, you see something darker unraveling. This wasn't just one man's rebellion. It was the embodiment of a fear buried deep in the American psyche, the fear that the enslaved had learned too much, that the tools given to them, whether knives, literacy, or religion, could become weapons sharper than any overseer's whip. The cover-up was not accidental. Judges sealed the files. Newspapers refused to print the truth. Even church records struck Isaac's name, as though by erasing the man, they could erase the lesson. Why? Because if word had spread that a single slave could dismantle 11 masters in one night, calmly, efficiently, with the precision of a surgeon, the entire system of slavery would have cracked from within. Fear would have spread faster than fire. And here is the most dangerous truth: fear did spread, quietly. Plantation owners began sleeping with pistols under their pillows. Families locked their doors at night for the first time. Ministers preached longer sermons on obedience, as though words could hold back the tide of vengeance. The South was shaken, but it buried the evidence under layers of silence. Because if Isaac's story survived, it would teach men something they were never meant to know, that mastery is not given by birth or wealth or law. It is taken. And once a man decides to take it, no system, no institution, no empire can stop him. Imagine a man who never spoke unless he had to. A man who answered questions with the smallest nod, who carried himself with such stillness that even overseers felt uneasy in his shadow. That was Isaac. He was not ignorant as they pretended. He was observant, always watching, always calculating. His silence was not weakness, it was control. Other enslaved men sang in the fields to survive, to dull the pain of endless hours under the sun. Isaac did not sing. He did not pray aloud. He did not weep. His power was in the gaze of those pale grey eyes, colourless, almost ghostly and unblinking. Overseers described the feeling of being studied, dissected, as if Isaac could see straight through the skin and into the machinery of a man's mind. At the slaughterhouse, his silence became ritual. His knives were arranged in precise order, polished until the blades reflected his face back at him in fragments. Every cut on an animal was a meditation, not just a task. He wasted nothing. He moved with precision, as though following a pattern only he understood. It unnerved others because brutality is one thing, but discipline is another. Brutality can be punished. Discipline cannot be controlled. The whispers began among the slaves first. They said Isaac never bled, that he could gut a hog and emerge without a single drop staining his clothes. Some said he sharpened his knives under the moonlight, whispering words no one could hear. Others claimed he was already dead, that he walked the earth only as a vessel for something darker, something that could not be chained. The masters laughed at such talk, dismissing it as superstition. But in private, even they admitted Isaac unsettled them. One overseer confided that he avoided eye contact altogether. "It is like staring into still water," he wrote, "and realizing it sees you back." This was the true terror of Isaac. Not his size, not his strength, but his mind. A mind that had learned patience, ritual, and the art of silence. A mind that waited. The plantations thrived on breaking men into pieces, but Isaac never broke. And when a man refuses to break, he becomes something the system cannot contain. That is why, when the knives finally turned from animals to men, no one was surprised by the precision. It had been rehearsed for years, in silence, beneath the gaze of grey eyes that promised one thing: judgment. The night of March 15th, 1857, began like any other at Petton Grove. The family gathered in the main hall for supper, Cornelius at the head of the table, his wife Margaret pouring wine, the children laughing softly beneath the heavy oil lamps. Servants moved silently in the background, eyes down, hands steady. Outside, the fields were still, the wind carrying only the faint scent of tobacco and river water. But in the slaughterhouse, Isaac prepared for something else. His tools were not scattered, they were aligned, blades glinting in the lamplight like a soldier's arsenal. He sharpened each one with deliberate strokes, stone against steel, a rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Some would later swear they heard him humming, not a tune of joy, but something low, guttural, like the growl of thunder rolling across hills. The first to die was Cornelius himself. His body was discovered in the study, his throat opened so cleanly that blood barely touched the carpet. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. It was as if Isaac had appeared out of the shadows, struck, and vanished. Margaret was found in the nursery, laid across the rocking chair, her chest pierced precisely where the heart beat. Her face was peaceful, too peaceful. Then the children. Samuel, 22, found in bed, both hands severed clean at the wrists before the fatal cut across his neck. Elizabeth, only 19, her body arranged at the foot of her bed as though she were kneeling in prayer. Thomas, 16, struck once directly to the heart, and little Mary, just 12 years old, discovered on her pillow with her eyes gently closed. The coroner later wrote that he could not tell if she had been asleep when the blade entered. The others, the grandmother Prudence, the spinster Aunt Catherine, and the physician brother Jonathan, each met deaths so exact that even medical examiners whispered of surgical skill. Joints separated at angles students of anatomy would recognize, arteries cut with terrifying precision, no wasted movement, no hesitation, 11 bodies, 11 cuts of justice, and not a single word spoken. When investigators arrived, they found no tracks leaving the estate, no smashed doors, no signs of theft, only the silence of a house turned into a tomb and the lingering scent of iron that clung to the air like a curse. Isaac was gone, and in that absence the South confronted its nightmare, a slave who had become more than a man, a force. A shadow moving beyond chains. By dawn, the Petton plantation was silent, its once proud halls soaked in shadows and blood. Neighbors arrived on horseback after hearing rumors of screams carried through the night air. What they found inside was not simply murder, it was revelation. 11 white bodies, stripped of authority, carved with such precision that it seemed less like crime and more like demonstration. And at the center of it all, the absence of Isaac, no body, no trace, no explanation. The sheriff was summoned, but his first words were not of justice. They were of containment. "This must not leave these walls," he whispered, voice trembling, because he understood what most dared not speak. If this story spread, if enslaved men across Virginia heard that one of their own had butchered 11 masters in a single night and vanished into the darkness, the South would burn from within. But the truth is difficult to silence. Overseers spoke in hushed tones to their wives. Slaves carried whispers through the quarters like sparks in dry grass. Isaac's name became a shadow invoked only at night. Some said he had escaped into the swamps, living like a phantom among the cypress trees. Others swore he still walked silently among plantations, disguised, waiting for another night to strike. The institutions moved quickly to bury the evidence. Court records were sealed under orders from Richmond. Newspapers received strict instructions, no mention, no detail, only an accident of fire. The official report told the public that the Petton family had perished in a tragic blaze, their home reduced to ashes in the night. But anyone who stepped foot inside those rooms knew better. There had been no fire, only blood, steel, and silence. The church preached obedience louder than ever in the weeks that followed. Pastors thundered that disobedience was sin, that rebellion was damnation. But their words betrayed a tremor of fear, because behind the pulpit they remembered the gray eyes of a man who had turned the tools of labor into the instruments of judgment. And so Isaac's story was buried, not just in archives but in the American mind. Buried because it revealed too much, that power is fragile, that control is an illusion, that the enslaved, once awakened, could dismantle their masters with the very discipline those masters had tried to cultivate. What Isaac left behind was not just bodies. It was a lesson, and lessons are harder to bury than corpses. Fear spread faster than fire across the South in the weeks that followed. The story of Isaac was supposed to be locked away in courthouse drawers, sealed beneath the stamp of official silence. But men talk, servants overhear, and whispers seep into every crack, no matter how tightly rulers try to seal them. By the end of that year, planters from Virginia to the Carolinas were locking their doors at night, something they had rarely done before. The idea that their slaves could rise was not new. Rebellions had flared before. Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 had haunted the South for decades, leaving nearly 60 whites dead and sending shockwaves through the plantations. But Turner's rebellion was chaotic, bloody, loud. Isaac was different. Isaac was methodical, controlled, surgical. He had not led a mob. He had not incited fire and fury. He had moved like a phantom, one man against 11, leaving nothing but silence and a lesson in anatomy. That distinction terrified the masters. Rage they understood. Rage could be punished. But precision? Precision was mastery, and mastery was supposed to belong only to them. Suddenly, every field hand sharpening a blade of cane looked suspicious. Every glance held too long was threatening. Every shadow in the night carried Isaac's ghost. The lawmakers responded first. Virginia tightened restrictions on slaves gathering after dark. Patrols were doubled, curfews enforced with brutal efficiency. New sermons were demanded from pulpits, preaching louder on obedience, submission, and the divine order of slavery. Preachers thundered that God himself had placed chains on the black man. But the louder they shouted, the more their voices revealed a hidden trembling. Because beneath their words was a truth they could not erase. Isaac had shown that control is not eternal. It is borrowed, fragile, always one act away from collapse. He had taken the knowledge given to him, the anatomy of animals, the patience of labor, and turned it against those who believed themselves untouchable. And this is where the story becomes dangerous for you right now. Because once you realize how thin the walls of control really are, once you see that even the greatest systems can be undone by a single act of precision, you begin to see the world differently. You begin to see the cracks in the structures around you, and the institutions that rule your life, governments, churches, corporations. They do not want you to see those cracks. That is why Isaac's name was buried. Not just because he killed, but because he revealed. Isaac disappeared into the night, but absence often speaks louder than presence. With no body, no trial, no execution, he became more than a man. He became a myth. Among the enslaved, his story spread in whispers passed around campfires, in coded songs hummed under the moonlight. He was not called Isaac the Butcher. That was the name whites tried to attach to him. To the enslaved, he was called the gray-eyed man, a ghost who walked without chains, a spirit who punished cruelty with silence. Mothers told their children to be strong like him. Men sharpening tools at dawn hummed his name under their breath. But the myth reached further. Abolitionist circles in the North caught fragments of the tale, carried by travelers and sympathetic preachers. Some saw in Isaac a terrifying kind of proof that the enslaved were not docile, not broken, but waiting. That beneath the surface of Southern civility lived a powder keg, and Isaac had struck a match. In hushed meetings, pamphlets were printed that hinted at him, never naming him directly, but invoking the judgment of the silent blade. Even whispers touched the hidden societies of the time, groups who believed that blood sacrifice and ritual could reshape history. To them, Isaac was not merely a man, but an omen, a figure who had transcended the role of victim and stepped into the forbidden role of executioner. In secret lodges, in candle-lit basements, men invoked his act as proof that all hierarchies can be inverted when a single will decides to act. The South, of course, tried to erase him. Planters told themselves he was dead, drowned in a swamp, eaten by dogs. Ministers branded him a demon, an unholy force to be cast out by prayer. But even in denial, they revealed their fear. Because Isaac's greatest power was not in the 11 bodies he left behind, it was in the idea he planted. The idea that one man, disciplined and silent, could unravel an entire illusion of control. And that is the truth. Institutions will always hide from you. They fear ideas more than weapons. They fear memory more than rebellion. They fear the figure who becomes myth, because myths cannot be chained. They can only be whispered, carried, and believed. Isaac's myth survived not in history books, but in the silence between words. And once you hear it, it lives in you too. When the South realized it could not erase Isaac's act, it turned to its oldest weapon, psychological control. Power is never maintained by chains alone. It is maintained by stories, the ones you are told about yourself, about your place in the order of the world, about what you may and may not dream. The first weapon was fear. Planters spoke in whispers to one another, but to their slaves they thundered warnings. They told them Isaac had been hunted, ripped apart, his body displayed as punishment. They invented gruesome ends, parading phantom corpses in their words, hoping terror would smother memory. But fear is a double-edged blade. It cuts the slave, yes, but it also cuts the master who must wield it every waking hour. The second weapon was law. Overnight, Virginia and neighboring states tightened restrictions on movement, gatherings, even literacy. Any sign of unrest became grounds for execution, preemptive violence disguised as order. The message was simple: the price of remembering Isaac is death. The third weapon was the pulpit. Ministers became mouthpieces for control, dressing obedience in holy language. They preached that rebellion was rebellion against God, that silence and submission were divine virtues. They weaponized scripture, reshaping it into chains tighter than iron. But those sermons were not confidence. They were desperation. Every shouted verse was an attempt to drown out the whisper of Isaac's name, echoing in the back of their minds. And then came the ultimate weapon: erasure. Court files sealed, newspapers forbidden. The Peton family memorialized not as victims of rebellion, but of accident. History itself was rewritten in real time. The masters understood that if you erase the record, you erase the possibility of imitation, but erasure has limits, because the human mind remembers what is forbidden more vividly than what is permitted. By trying to bury Isaac, they only made him more dangerous. He became a shadow figure, untraceable, untouchable, always just out of reach. And in that way, Isaac accomplished something rare. He left the realm of history and entered the realm of legend, and this is where you must pause. Because I need you to understand, the same systems that buried Isaac's story are still at work around you today. Fear, law, religion, erasure. Control is never about truth. It is about narrative. Whoever writes the story rules the mind. Isaac's story was not just buried in the soil of Virginia. It was buried in the human mind. But here's the truth. The weapons used against him are the same weapons used against you today. Only the costumes have changed. The plantation has grown into an empire, and the chains are no longer made of iron. They are made of language, screens, policies, and lies. Think about fear. The masters used the rumor of Isaac's mutilation to keep others obedient. Today, fear comes packaged through your media. A daily drip of terror designed to paralyze you. War plague, collapse, enemies at your door. Fear keeps you dependent, keeps you docile. You think you are informed, but you are being trained. Think about law. After Isaac's act, new restrictions were written overnight. Today, laws appear with the same purpose, not to protect, but to control. Surveillance disguised as safety, regulation disguised as order. At every step, the message is identical: resist, and you will be crushed. Think about the pulpit. Ministers once thundered obedience from altars. Now the pulpit has been replaced by institutions, schools, influencers, leaders in tailored suits. They do not speak of salvation. They speak of progress, unity, and the greater good. But the message has not changed. Submit. Silence yourself, and you will be rewarded. And think about erasure. Isaac was scrubbed from the record so his ghost would not inspire others. Today, inconvenient truths vanish in real time. Articles deleted, counts banned. Histories rewritten in your textbooks before the ink has even dried. You are told not what happened, but what you are allowed to believe happened. This is the system you are living in. Isaac's story is not just the past, it is the mirror. The same machinery of control, the same manipulation of thought, the same fear of what happens when even one man refuses to play the part assigned to him. That is why Isaac's myth survived. Because once a story like his exists, it cannot be killed. It lingers like a shadow, whispering the same forbidden truth. Control only works if you agree to believe it, and that is what terrifies those in power. Not Isaac's knife, not his silence, not the graves he dug. What they fear most is the idea that you might remember and act. When flesh disappears, legend takes its place. And Isaac, whether alive or swallowed by the swamps, became more than a man. He became a presence, an invisible hand pressing against the conscience of the South. His silence spoke louder than sermons, his absence heavier than chains. Among the enslaved, his myth grew teeth. He was not just a man who had killed his masters. He was a force, a shadow that walked through fields at night. They said his grey eyes glowed in the dark, watching overseers from the tree line. They said whips frayed when they touched his spirit. They said dogs refused to hunt him because even beasts recognized his will. Mothers told their children, Isaac waits for us. When the time comes, he will rise again. To the broken, he became hope. To the defiant, he became proof. And to the powerful, he became terror. Because myths have a way of unraveling control. Authority depends on obedience, and obedience depends on belief. If a man can vanish into the night after burying 9 masters alive, then belief itself fractures. The illusion cracks, and when it cracks, it spreads like a sickness. The South's ministers tried to fight the myth by casting him as a devil, a beast, a demon who had surrendered his soul. But even that backfired. A devil feared is still a devil believed in. Every attempt to brand Isaac as evil only cemented him as real. The harder they tried to kill him in story, the stronger he became in memory. And here lies the forbidden truth. Every empire fears its own ghost. Isaac became that ghost. The whisper that even the lowest, even the most broken, holds the power to invert the hierarchy. His myth carried a promise that all control is fragile, that even the strongest chains shatter under the will of one who no longer fears death. That is why his name was never taught to you. That is why you had to hear it here, in this forbidden telling, because stories like Isaac's are not safe. They do not inspire obedience, they inspire rebellion. They remind you that men are not powerless, that fear is not eternal, that silence can sometimes roar louder than the loudest command. Isaac's ghost did not die. It lingers, waiting, watching, whispering. Legends do not stay where they are born. They travel, slipping into mouths, into prayers, into symbols carved in secret. And Isaac's legend, though suppressed, found its way into the hidden societies of the 19th century. Not the polite lodges of businessmen, but the forbidden circles where men whispered of blood, power, and rebellion. In the basements of northern cities, abolitionists spoke of him without naming him. They referred to the gray-eyed man as an omen, proof that divine justice could wear human flesh. To them, he was not merely a killer of masters, but a sacred reversal. The enslaved turned judge, the oppressed turned executioner. He was invoked as a reminder that liberation would not come politely, but violently, like the sudden strike of a knife in the night. But outside the abolitionist cause, there were others who listened. Occult fraternities, half political, half mystical, saw Isaac as more than a man. They saw him as archetype, the silent blade, the inverted pyramid, the man who transcends law by writing his own. In candlelit rites, his name was coded into prayers, hidden among Latin phrases and Masonic symbols. They treated him as a spirit of rebellion, a shadow that could be summoned to dissolve fear and awaken strength. And here lies the unsettling truth. Isaac became useful even to those who never cared for freedom. Power-hungry secret orders twisted him into a weapon, an emblem of overturning hierarchies not for liberation, but for domination. To them, Isaac was proof that control is never absolute, that terror can shift hands, that the throne itself is fragile. They wore his myth like armor, like a charm against obedience. Do you see the pattern? The very thing the South tried to erase became fuel for movements, symbols and rituals far beyond the plantations. A single act, buried in secrecy, was transformed into a living icon, circulating among those who understood that history itself is a battlefield of memory. And this is why Isaac still matters. Because every system of control fears the man who slips their grasp. The myth they cannot kill. And when that myth is fed in secret, in lodges, in brotherhoods, in whispers between men who hunger for freedom or for power, it never truly dies. Isaac the man was lost. Isaac the myth became immortal. There is a power in silence that words can never match. Kings, priests, overseers, they speak endlessly, drowning the world in decrees and sermons. But Isaac never needed words. His silence was sharper than any blade he carried, heavier than the iron chains that once bound him. When overseers cursed at him, he did not answer. When masters ordered him, he nodded but gave nothing of himself. When fellow slaves whispered in fear, he listened but revealed nothing. That void, that refusal to be known, unnerved them more than open defiance. A slave was expected to bow, to beg, to sing spirituals in broken tones. Isaac did none of this. He walked through the plantation as if he were not part of it at all, as if he were watching from the other side of some invisible glass. That silence became its own mythology. Children whispered that Isaac could speak, but only to the dead. Overseers claimed they saw him standing still for hours, staring at the tree line as if waiting for something. Even the Petons, in their arrogance, admitted to one another that his presence carried a peculiar dread. They had purchased a butcher, but what they really owned was a shadow that refused to be tamed. Here is the forbidden truth. Silence itself is a weapon of psychological control. Those who dominate you expect a reaction, because reaction proves you are within their field of power. To give nothing back, no word, no cry, no plea, denies them the satisfaction of ownership. Isaac embodied this principle so completely that his muteness became terrifying. He inverted the hierarchy not with rebellion, but with absence. And when the bloodletting came, it was not accompanied by shouts or chants or calls for vengeance. It was quiet, a knife sliding through ribs, a breath cut short, a room filling with stillness as life drained out. Isaac did not roar, he erased. That silence spread through the plantation like a contagion, suffocating every scream before it fully left the throat. To men who seek mastery over themselves, this is the lesson. Words are cheap. Silence is priceless. The ability to withhold, to conserve, to deny your enemies the smallest fragment of your inner self, that is where power breeds. Isaac knew this without ever writing a manifesto. His silence was his manifesto, and it was written in blood. When Isaac disappeared into the Virginia night, he did not leave behind a body to bury, nor chains to recover. He left absence, and in that absence, terror multiplied. The Peton house stood as a slaughtered shell, its masters carved apart with surgical precision. But Isaac himself, gone. No footprints in the mud, no trail of blood, no whisper of where he had fled. Some claimed he vanished into the swamps, others swore he was hidden by abolitionists. A few muttered that he had never been a man at all, but a spirit summoned to mete out justice before dissolving back into the earth. For months afterward, slaveholders across Virginia could not sleep. Doors were bolted, rifles were kept by the bedside, lanterns burned through the night. And yet fear gnawed them alive, because it was not what Isaac had done that haunted them. It was what he might do next. Would he return? Would he strike again? Or had he left behind disciples, silent men with knives waiting for the moment to act? Rumors multiplied in the quarters. Some slaves whispered that Isaac had not fled at all, but walked among them in disguise, watching, teaching, preparing. Every shadow in the field seemed suspect. Every cough in the night sounded like a signal. The absence became presence. The void became weight. Isaac was everywhere precisely because he was nowhere. Here lies the psychological brilliance of his vanishing. He did not need to strike twice. One act of erasure was enough to cripple the mind of an entire class of men who thought themselves untouchable. His escape turned into a haunting. Even those who mocked the idea of ghosts admitted that the silence after his massacre was unbearable, as though the land itself had absorbed his rage and was waiting to release it again. This is how control collapses, not with armies, not with treaties, but with uncertainty. Men can endure violence. They cannot endure terror that has no face, no form, no boundary. Isaac's absence was a mirror. In it, masters saw their own vulnerability reflected back them, magnified until it consumed their peace. And so, a single vanished man did more to fracture the illusion of control than all the rebellions, pamphlets, or speeches combined. His silence lived on, not in words, but in the way the powerful flinched at shadows. History is not truth. It is architecture, a structure built carefully by those who fear what truth might do if left unchecked. Isaac's story proves this, for his massacre was not simply forgotten, it was erased, court records sealed, newspaper reports pulled from circulation, even whispers punished. Plantation owners gathered in back rooms agreeing on one thing: if Isaac's name spread, it would ignite a wildfire no whip could control. The South already lived in fear of rebellion. Isaac's silence had shown them that fear was justified. To let his legend live was to plant dynamite beneath the foundations of their empire. So they buried him. The Virginia legislature ordered court documents locked in iron vaults, never to be opened. Preachers stepped into pulpits and insisted the massacre was the work of outside agitators, refusing to name the hand that held the blade. Families who had once gossiped about Isaac's pale eyes fell suddenly mute, as if his very memory was dangerous to keep. And so, he was exiled from history. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded. That is the greatest mark of terror, when the powerful pretend you never existed. But let us strip back the illusion. Erasure itself is a form of control. To decide what men remember is to decide what futures they can imagine. If Isaac had been remembered as he was, a man who shattered the hierarchy in one night, the enslaved might have drawn power from his example. Instead, they were left with only whispers, scattered and broken, while their oppressors held the narrative. Do you see the pattern? It repeats across centuries. Every system that enslaves, manipulates, or exploits must control memory. They do not only chain bodies, they chain history. They feed you what you are allowed to know, while burying the knowledge that could make you dangerous. Isaac was too dangerous to be taught, too powerful to be written down, too commanding to be turned into a parable, so they chose silence. But silence, as Isaac showed, is not emptiness. It is pressure, it is weight, and buried knowledge leaks, like blood seeping from a sealed casket. Isaac's name survived, not because the state permitted it, but because fear preserved it. The forbidden cannot be destroyed, it only waits. You might think Isaac's story is just a relic, a bloody footnote in a century of violence. But that is exactly what they want you to think, because the method they used to erase him has not vanished. It has evolved. Look closely. Every system of power still decides what you are allowed to remember. School textbooks polish slavery into polite terms, softening the cruelty, deleting the fire. Museums curate the past like stage plays, showing you artifacts but stripping away the terror that birthed them. And when documents do surface, court records, sealed reports, forbidden testimonies, they are either buried in academic vaults or dismissed as too disturbing for public consumption. Does that sound familiar? It is the same formula used to make Isaac vanish, because the truth is not just history, it is a weapon. And in the wrong hands, truth becomes contagious. It spreads, awakens, ignites. That is why they keep it locked. Here is the uncomfortable part. Isaac's silence mirrors the silence imposed on you now. The systems around you, governments, corporations, even the culture itself, demand noise. Endless chatter, empty slogans, recycled news, distractions without weight. But what do they forbid? Stillness. Reflection. The quiet space where forbidden truths emerge. just as they once feared Isaac's mute defiance. They fear you when you withdraw from their noise and begin to see. And so, the burial of Isaac is not just about one massacre in 1857. It is a mirror of your own reality. You are told what to think about history. You are told which villains deserve memory and which rebels deserve oblivion. You are fed illusions of freedom, while the real chains are forged in silence, in absence, in what you are never meant to hear. This is why the legend of Isaac still matters. It reveals the pattern. Rebellion punished, violence erased, terror transmuted into control. And if they could silence him, what else have they silenced? What other names, other uprisings, other forbidden truths have been scrubbed from your memory before you ever knew they existed? Ask yourself, how many Isaacs are buried beneath the pages you were never allowed to read? How many shadows stalk the edges of your education? And most importantly, what will you do when you realize silence has been their weapon all along? By now you feel it, don't you? That tightening in your chest. That uneasy awareness that this isn't just a story about a man long dead. It's a mirror held up to you. Isaac's blade is not in your hand, but his silence is. And that silence demands something of you, because once you've heard this, you can't unhear it. You can't slide back into comfort, into the lies they packaged for you. You've stepped outside the script. You've tasted what was forbidden. That changes a man forever. But here's the danger. Knowledge without action is nothing. They want you to consume stories, feel chills, then move on. Distracted, pacified, harmless. That is why I'm going to ask something of you now. Not for me, for you. In the comments, I want you to write the phrase "the shadow walks," not once, but twice. Do it exactly like that. Write it 2 times back to back. Why? Because repetition is how the subconscious locks a symbol into your identity. It is how you mark yourself, not just as a listener, but as someone who has crossed the threshold and refuses to step back. The shadow walks. That was what they whispered when they feared Isaac had returned. It was the phrase passed in secret. The phrase that meant he cannot be erased because he lives wherever terror remains. By typing it, you align yourself with that shadow. Not a killer, but a man who cannot be silenced. Understand? This is not a gimmick. It is a ritual, a way of proving that you are not just an audience member, but a participant in forbidden knowledge. Men who hide behind comfort will scroll past this. But you, if you write it, you declare that silence will not chain you, that you see through the manipulation, that you carry the shadow with you. So write it. Twice. Seal it. And remember this. Every system of control begins to fracture the moment a man refuses to forget. The shadow does not beg to be remembered. It walks whether you accept it or not. The only question is, will you walk with it? You've walked this far with me, deeper than most men would dare. And now, at the end, the truth cannot be softened. Isaac's story was never just about blood spilled in Virginia. It is about the nature of power itself. Understand this. Systems of control always look eternal from the inside. To the Petons, slavery was invincible, ordained, permanent. To the overseers, the whip was the last word. To the masters, their wealth and walls made them untouchable. But one silent man shattered that illusion in a single night. That is the secret they try to bury. Not just that rebellion happened, but that rebellion is always possible. That no hierarchy, no empire, no institution stands forever. The powerful fear men like Isaac, not because of the knives they carry, but because of the proof they embody. That control can collapse overnight, and when it does, memory becomes weapon, and here we are. 1857 is not so far away. The plantations are gone, but the manipulation remains. You are still fed curated truths. You are still told which rebels to admire and which to forget. You are still lulled into obedience with distractions, while the forbidden is buried in silence. The plantations have changed form, but the chains, they are still here. So what now? That is your question, because you cannot unknow this. You cannot pretend Isaac never existed. He is in you now, not as a killer, but as a symbol of refusal, of silence turned into power, of absence turned into terror. He is proof that history is not a monument, but a battlefield. And once you step onto it, you are no longer innocent. So hear me clearly. You carry the shadow forward. Every time you question the official story, every time you pierce the illusion, every time you refuse to forget, Isaac walks again. Not in flesh, but in you. That is why they fear men who awaken, because the awakened cannot be chained. The shadow walks, and now it walks with you.